The late summer air in the western highlands carried more than dust. It held warning weight in the memory of things that never truly died. On the edge of a quiet homestead, Eleanor Ellie Whitlow stood ankle-deep in her herb garden, her fingers buried in soil that remembered more than she cared to name. The thyme grew thick near the fence line, and bees traced lazy spirals through the stalks like they were following the lines of a hymn only they could hear. She didn't hum anymore, not like she used to, but her hands still worked with the rhythm of someone trying to hold on to purpose. Her braid was coming loose, but she left it. The August heat pressed down, not cruelly, just insistently, like time itself leaning into her bones. For 6 years, the only voices on her land had been wind hens and the creaking timbers of the house her late husband left behind. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was stubborn, like a wound scabbed over but never quite closed. Then they appeared. 2 riders on the ridge above her home, still as the horizon behind them. At first glance, Ellie thought they were shadows cast by the sun, illusions conjured by the heat. But their presence didn't waver. They sat tall on their horses, one built like a granite bluff, the other leaner, alert like a whip coiled mid-snap. They didn't yell, didn't wave, just watched. Ellie didn't move at first. Her fingers stayed buried in the soil, but her breath had shortened. Her apron speckled with dirt and clinging herbs fluttered slightly in the wind. The house behind her seemed to shift too, as though holding its breath. She rose slowly, dusting her hands. Her rifle leaned against the doorway, but she didn't reach for it. Not yet. They came down the trail in no rush. Men used to being watched, but never hurried. One wore a worn duster, the sleeves sun-bleached and fraying. The other had no hat, just a crown of black hair tied at the nape. They weren't asking permission. They were simply arriving. She stepped onto the porch and let the screen door click behind her. Her voice, when it came, was low, controlled, and edged with fatigue, older than either of them. "If you're looking to buy, turn around. This land's not for sale." The larger of the two nodded once. The younger offered a crooked half smile, more out of respect than charm. "Not buying," he said. "Just water and shade. We won't stay the night." Ellie hesitated. Her boots felt rooted to the porch boards. She looked toward the horizon as though expecting someone else to speak in her stead. But of course no one came. No one ever came. Just bees and the wind and the ache that lived between them. "There's the trough," she said after a long pause. "Willow trees got some cover." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she held it steady. They dismounted without flair. No dust kicked up, no clumsy stomping. Even the horses moved gently, like they knew not to spook the silence. She didn't ask names, didn't offer bread or tea. But as the larger man called her, the name would come to her later like a stone remembered from a dream, removed his boots. Before stepping near her porch, something shifted in her. Not fear, not threat, just a flicker of something unfamiliar. An old door inside her, not yet open but no longer locked. She went back inside and set the kettle to boil out of habit. But she didn't finish the motion. She let the flame go cold. These men weren't hers to host. Still, she found herself listening for the sound of them speaking, for footsteps outside the window. For the first time in years, the hush around her wasn't just silence. It was change. The next morning came quiet as always, though something in the stillness had changed. The wind moved differently, more curious than indifferent, and the house seemed to breathe slower, as though sensing it was no longer the only living thing on the land. Eleanor Whitlow stirred before the rooster called. She wasn't sleeping well, not from nightmares, but from something harder to name. Expectation, perhaps, or reluctance. Through the kitchen window, she saw Calder near the barn, chopping wood in a slow, methodical rhythm. Each swing was measured, not aggressive, not impatient. It was the kind of movement that came from a man used to shaping his life with his hands. Not breaking things, but understanding them. She watched the way he paused between strikes, fingertips brushing the grain like he was reading a language carved by time. The axe rose and fell like breath, controlled, intentional. It unsettled her more than violence might have. Violence, at least, she understood, but reverence. That was harder to look at. Not far off, Finn was crouched near the chicken pen, muttering to himself as he worked a piece of twine into the gate latch. His hands were quick, clever, and he whistled a tune that danced through the morning air, off-key and cheerful, a sharp contrast to Calder's silent labor. Ellie almost smiled at the absurdity of it all, one man moving like stone, the other like wind. She stepped outside without announcing herself, the screen door clicking shut behind her. Neither of them looked up, not out of rudeness, but as if they already knew she was there and were giving her the choice to speak first. She cleared her throat. "You two always plan to linger like moss, or are you fixing to move on soon?" Calder didn't stop his swing. He simply wiped the back of his hand across his brow and answered without turning. "Today's good for mending." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement. And somehow that made her feel more in control than if he'd asked permission. Ellie crossed her arms, trying not to let the corner of her mouth betray her. Finn, sensing the shift, grinned from behind the henhouse. "You'd be amazed what a gate latch says about a place," he said. "This one here's got history held together by habit, mostly." She raised a brow. "And you're an expert in chicken psychology, I suppose?" He tipped his head, mock serious. "Only the most dramatic hens. The quiet ones don't trust me." For a moment she forgot how to frown. Just for a moment. They stayed through the afternoon. Calder split wood until the pile looked more like a winter's worth of preparation than a day's work. Finn patched the chicken gate, then moved on to tightening the hinges on her back door, humming the whole time. Ellie busied herself with eggs and laundry and anything that kept her hands occupied, but her mind kept drifting. It was the smallest things that got to her, the way Calder removed his boots before stepping on the porch. How Finn avoided the threshold unless invited, how neither of them spoke unless they had something to say. When she brought in the hens for the evening, Calder was sitting beneath the willow tree with his eyes half closed, head tilted to the sky. She stopped a few paces away, basket in hand, and watched him. He didn't speak, didn't move, just listened. Not to her, to the world. "You always this quiet?" she asked after a beat, his eyes opened slow and steady. "Only when it's worth hearing." She wasn't sure what that meant, but it stayed with her longer than it should have. That night she found herself setting 3 cups on the counter instead of 1. She scowled at the extra tin mug like it had betrayed her. Then she put it back in the cabinet. These men weren't hers to serve. Still, when she stepped out just before dusk, she brought a small kettle and left it on the porch railing. No words, no invitation. Finn saw it first. "You sure this isn't a trap?" he called out, lifting the kettle with exaggerated caution. "Last time I accepted tea from a stranger, I woke up painted blue in Santa Fe." Ellie leaned on the doorframe. "You might look better blue." Flattered, he said, pouring himself a cup and wincing. "Strong enough to wake the dead." "It's supposed to be," she replied. "Keeps cowards off the porch." Calder accepted his without commentary. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture that made her breath catch more than it should have. It wasn't deference, it was gratitude. And for a woman who hadn't been looked at with kindness in half a decade, that small nod echoed. Later, through the warped glass of her bedroom window, she watched them sitting by a low fire near the edge of the yard. They didn't talk much. Finn poked the coals with a stick, telling a story she couldn't hear, and Calder sat still, back straight, eyes on the sky. She should have felt uneasy, but instead there was something grounding in their presence, like the house itself had stopped holding its breath. She lay down, facing the empty half of the bed that hadn't been touched in years. Her fingers curled around the edge of the sheet. It had been a long time since anyone's laughter had settled on her land, and longer still since she'd wanted it to stay. As sleep tugged at her, she thought of Calder's silence, of Finn's grin, of the quiet hum returning to her porch. Not as a threat, but a presence. And just before she drifted off, she whispered to the dark, not as a wish, but as a truth she wasn't ready to name aloud. They haven't left, and I'm not sure I want them to. The town noticed before she was ready to admit it. It started with little things: the storekeeper's wife no longer returning her gaze, a neighbor's boy who used to wave now, keeping his eyes on the dirt as she rode by. What had once been indifference had sharpened into something colder, tighter, and deliberate. Eleanor Whitlow wasn't surprised, not really. It wasn't the first time her name passed from lips like a warning. But now it wasn't just about her. There were two men on her land, one with skin too dark for forgiveness, the other too free with his laughter. That was enough to stoke old fires in a town like Glen Hollow. She rode into town for feed and oil the same way she had for years. Quiet, efficient, respectful. But that week no one returned her nod. Mabel Greeley stood outside the mercantile with her arms folded like a crow guarding a fence post. Her voice carried across the street as Ellie dismounted. "Some folks invite trouble the way others invite rain," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can't complain when the storm settles." Ellie didn't look at her, didn't even glance, but the words clung like burrs under her collar. Inside the store, the clerk hesitated when she asked for sugar. Out he mumbled without checking. She bought flour instead, though she didn't need it. As she paid, he dropped her change without touching her palm. On the way out, Tommy Rourke, the boy who often helped her carry supplies, intercepted her beside her mule cart. He held a small sack of seed potatoes and a folded note. "My ma says we won't be trading anymore," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Said to return this." She took the sack in silence. The note was brief. "Find your own kind, no name, just bitterness." She stared at the handwriting, then folded it twice and tucked it into her apron without comment. Tommy lingered, chewing his lip. "Miss Whitlow, they're saying things, that your Apache sleeps on your porch, that the younger one's fixing up your gate like he owns it." Ellie looked at him, tired but steady. "Do you believe it?" He shrugged. "Doesn't matter what I believe. Mama says when a woman doesn't protect her name, someone else will ruin it for her." "That's funny," she said. "I thought I already lost it." Tommy flushed and mumbled a goodbye. She watched him go and didn't wave. Back home, the fields felt different, quieter, more exposed. Even the bees moved with hesitation, circling her skirt as she walked between rows of sage. The kettle hadn't whistled yet, but she poured herself a cup anyway, hands shaking just enough for her to notice the porch creaked under the weight of footsteps that weren't hers. Calder stood beside her, arms crossed, looking out over the wheat. "You heard?" she asked, not needing to clarify. He nodded once. She gripped the cup tighter. "They're going to come, not just with words next time." Calder's voice was even grounded. "We'll be here." "That's not what I meant," she snapped, then softened. "They'll come for me, not you. You think they'll leave us out of it?" He wasn't asking. He was reminding. Later that evening, they sat under the willow, the three of them. Finn passed around a plate of biscuits he claimed were from a recipe he'd stolen from a saloon cook in Colorado Springs. Calder said nothing, but Ellie noticed the way his eyes lingered on the fields, always watching the road without moving his head. Finn tried to distract her with a story about a lost fiddle player and a love affair involving a goat. But even his voice held a strain that didn't belong to humor. She broke the silence. "I once sang in the church choir, you know." Finn looked up mid-bite. Is that right before they told me I wasn't welcome anymore? Said I brought shame, that I poisoned my husband, that I stayed too calm when they buried him. Finn's face fell. Calder didn't move, but his attention sharpened. I didn't poison him, she said, more to herself than them. He died because he got caught. Horse thieving, lying, drinking. Men like him don't get to die clean. Calder's voice came soft, steady. You don't have to explain. But I do, she whispered, because they keep saying it, and I keep hearing it. She didn't cry. She hadn't in years, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her dress like she wanted to tear something open. Calder reached over, not quickly, not boldly, and placed a small object on the porch beside her hand. It was a piece of bark, smooth and warm, from his pocket. Carved into it was a simple curve looping like wind. She looked at him, puzzled. What does it mean, survivor? He said. She held it like it weighed more than stone. Later that week, Finn returned from town with dust on his boots and unease in his voice. They're talking louder now, he said. Mabel's threatening to send word to the marshal. Let her write. Ellie replied, standing taller than she had in days. You know what they'll say about you. I do. Finn hesitated. And Calder? She looked across the yard, where Calder was hammering a new beam into the barn frame. He's more welcome on this land than anyone who's ever sat in those pews. That night, Ellie left dinner on the porch, venison stew with herbs from her garden. No words, no invitation, just 3 bowls, 3 chairs, 1 fire. They sat together in silence, not to avoid words, but because sometimes silence is the only language that fits, the only one that means I see you. I'm not leaving. And slowly, without needing to be told, the wind in Glen Hollow began to change direction. The invitation never came, but Eleanor expected that. The harvest dance was never meant for women like her. It was a celebration reserved for pew-sitters, pie bakers, and women who still wore ribbons in their hair and kept their voices gentle. It was not for the widow whose husband died with a rope around his neck, or for the woman who shared her land with 2 outsiders, one Apache, the other a drifter with nothing but stories and a crooked grin. Still, despite knowing that she pulled the blue calico dress from the cedar chest where it had lain untouched for years, the fabric smelled faintly of lavender and ash. She held it up to the light, inspecting the seams for wear. She told herself it was only to air it out, but when she tried it on, and it still fit just differently with the years now stitched into her waist and shoulders. She stood a little longer at the mirror than she meant to. When Tommy Rourke came by the next morning to return a pie tin, he shifted from foot to foot awkwardly. Mama says folks from Clayton'll be coming to the dance this year, he said. Big crowd, bigger watchful eyes. Then he handed her a folded piece of paper. On it, a crudely drawn bee inked with care. On the back, in a shaky but earnest hand, "You still matter." Ellie didn't speak. She only touched the edge of the drawing and nodded. Tommy flushed, tipped his hat, and left without further comment. That night, the air smelled of smoke and river dust. Lanterns had already been strung across the churchyard when Ellie stepped out wearing the blue dress. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't have to. Finn and Calder sat on the porch, quiet. Calder glanced up first. His gaze didn't widen, didn't shift, but he stood. "You aiming to get me arrested for scandal?" Finn said, half laughing. She walked past them, boots thudding softly against the earth, her braid tied with a single strip of gray ribbon. She left behind the smell of lavender and something harder to name, resolve. The ride into town was quiet, only the sound of the saddle leather creaking and her breath keeping rhythm. When she arrived, laughter spilled into the night like cider too sweet to hold. Lantern light flickered across dance dresses and polished boots. As Ellie stepped into the clearing, the music faltered. Eyes turned. No hands reached for hers. Mabel Greeley was the first to speak, her voice like vinegar in honey. "Well, look who found her ribbons." A few nervous laughs followed. "Guess shame don't last forever." Ellie didn't stop walking, but each step felt heavier, like dragging memories behind her. Then hoofbeats cut across the hush. 2 horses emerged from the dark. Calder on his black mare rode with the same stillness he always carried, like a man born of mountains and dusk. Finn beside him grinned wide and winked at the first girl who dared look up. The silence that followed felt like something sacred being tested. Calder dismounted and tied his reins. He wasn't dressed for dancing, wore the same earth-toned shirt and worn leather. But now there was a red band tied around his upper arm, stark against the dusk. He met Ellie's eyes across the lantern glow and gave a single nod. She didn't know if it was an invitation or a challenge, but her feet began to move. They didn't dance. They walked slowly side by side, circling the gathering like 2 sentinels reclaiming ground. The crowd parted without thinking. The fiddle picked up again, but no one led a partner forward. They weren't part of the rhythm. They were the beat beneath it. Halfway through the yard, Ellie stopped. Calder did too. She didn't turn, but her voice carried. "Why did you come?" His answer came steady. "Because you did. They'll say worse things now." He gave it a beat. "They already have. You don't care, I've lived through worse." Her lips trembled, but she kept her spine straight. "So have I." At that moment, a young girl, barely 16, stepped forward, clutching a tin cup of cider with both hands. She offered it to Ellie with wide, unsure eyes. Ellie accepted it without a word, not because she was thirsty, but because someone saw her and chose kindness anyway. From behind, Mabel hissed again, "Shameless." Calder turned toward her, slowly, not with anger, but with a calm that made the air still. "She's braver than anyone here," he said, voice low but carrying. "You should remember that before you open your mouth again." Mabel flushed red and backed away, swallowing whatever came next. That night, as they rode home beneath a sky bloated with stars, Ellie let the wind tug at her hem. She didn't fight it. She didn't fix her braid. She dismounted at the gate and saw the lantern still burning on the porch. She didn't rush to blow it out. Instead, she sat on the steps, the cider cup still warm in her palm. Calder passed by silent, but left something beside her before walking toward the barn, a smooth stone with a single carved line across its center. The same symbol he once gave her on bark. She traced it with her thumb. The meaning hadn't changed. Survivor. And for the first time since her husband died, the word didn't taste bitter. It tasted like truth. They came in the dry stillness of afternoon, 3 men on saddle-worn horses, their approach slow but arrogant. The kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder but with expectation. Dust curled beneath the hooves, settling across Eleanor Whitlow's land like ash, unwanted and heavy. She saw them from the porch, squinting against the sun as they crested the reed, and her breath caught not in fear but in recognition. Men like this didn't come to barter. They came to take. Calder was down by the eastern fence, repairing a slat the wind had worried loose. He straightened slowly as the riders drew closer, hammer still in hand, body relaxed but coiled with readiness. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply stood tall and unflinching, watching them descend like shadows. Eleanor didn't reach for her rifle, though it rested by the door. She stepped off the porch with her back straight, apron dusted with flour, hands steady at her sides. These men, led by Cyrus Pike, broad as he was bitter, wore their cruelty like a badge. One had a jagged scar down his cheek. The youngest couldn't have been more than 20, his gaze already mean. They dismounted with a clumsy bravado, boots thudding against dry earth like they meant to remind her of the sound. "Well, if it ain't the widow Whitlow." Pike drawled, sweeping his hat off and letting it dangle from 2 fingers. Didn't figure we'd find you still playing house out here. Thought maybe you'd ridden south with your guests. His voice curled with mockery. Eleanor said nothing. The second man laughed, spitting into the dirt near her feet. Heard you've been keeping company with a red man and a thief. Town says you've turned your home into a fort for outlaws. She met his gaze and didn't blink. This land belongs to me. I open my door to who I please. Cyrus stepped closer, his eyes crawling across her like grease. That's so. You always had a taste for the strange. Shame your husband ain't here to see what you've become. I think, came Calder's voice, low and precise. That's far enough. They turned. Calder walked forward slowly, hammer still in his right hand, his steps even. There was no haste in him, no performance, just the presence of a man who knew what he could do and didn't need to prove it. Cyrus barked a laugh. You going to fix me next? Chief Calder didn't answer. He stopped a few feet away and planted his boots like roots. The youngest rider shifted, uneasy now. You came here for noise, Calder said calmly. You've made it, now ride on. Pike's hand drifted toward his coat, and in the space between breath and motion, Calder moved. The hammer left his hand like a whisper, with weight thudding into the dirt just inches from Pike's boot. It didn't hit flesh. It didn't need to. The message was louder than a shout. One more step and you'll regret it. Pike froze. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She stood with her arms at her sides, a storm behind still eyes. She had spent years being stared down by people who thought silence meant surrender. She was done with that. You think she needs you to fight her battles? Pike sneered, still not stepping back. Calder didn't blink. She's already won them. I'm just here to witness. That landed harder than the hammer. The third man finally rattled, muttered something, and stepped back toward his horse. Pike glared at Eleanor like he expected her to apologize for existing. You've brought shame to your name, he spat. She tilted her head, voice sharp as broken glass. You mean the name you all tried to bury next to a man who beat me bloody and called it devotion, that name? He had no answer. Get off my land, she said. And for the first time in years, her voice held no tremor. They left without honor, without parting words. The dust rose behind them as they vanished into the horizon like bad weather finally passing. Finn returned hours later, arms full of wild plums and jokes he didn't get to tell. As soon as Calder filled him in, he dropped the sack and shook his head. Always miss the fun, he muttered, then turned to Eleanor. You good I didn't cry, she said. Finn tilted his head. Would have been fine if you had, but I didn't. Calder, seated on the porch rail, added quietly, You didn't need to. That night they ate on the porch beneath a sliver of moon and a sky scattered with starlight. There was no fire, no music. Just a bowl of cornbread passed between them, hands brushing in the dark. Eleanor didn't speak for a long time. She simply listened to the way her breath no longer caught when someone approached from behind. To the way Calder's presence felt less like a shadow and more like shelter. I was scared, she admitted. Not of them. Of what it would mean if no one stood up. If I had to face them alone. Calder nodded once. But you didn't. I don't think I want to be alone anymore. You're not, he said like a statement of fact. Later, as the wind stirred the wheat and the bees settled into their hives, Eleanor found herself carving again small things. At first, a spoon, a bowl, a sign. When she finished, she handed it to Calder and said, You hang it. He did with care. The wood bore 5 simple words, Whitlow's place, all are welcome. And in that act, beneath a porch worn by weather and time, a woman once silenced by shame declared her home a place of peace and herself finally its rightful keeper. The days that followed moved like creek water in summer, slow, steady, with moments so quiet they felt holy. No more shouting, no more riders with spit on their boots and hatred in their mouths. Just the rhythms of a life slowly being rebuilt from the inside out. Eleanor Whitlow began to wake. Not to dread, but to habit the creak of the porch boards as Calder stepped out before dawn, the scrape of Finn's boots as he sang badly to the hens, the soft buzzing of bees drawn to the herbs drying by her window. Her mornings no longer echoed, they were shared. She didn't call it love, not out loud, not even to herself, but it lived in the details, in the way Calder poured the last of the coffee into her cup without asking, in how Finn fixed her roof and claimed he was just stretching his legs, in the clean bandages Calder replaced on her hands even after the cuts had long healed. One morning she stood at the gate watching the wheat bend in the wind and realized something strange. She couldn't remember the last time she'd rehearsed a defense for her past. The need to explain herself had faded, not because the world had changed, but because she had. They still talked in town, of course they did, but their voices didn't seem to reach as far anymore. When she returned from errands, there were fewer stares. One woman left a jar of jam on her porch, another dropped off a packet of carrot seeds, not apologies but beginnings. And then came the evening when it all folded into something whole. The three of them sat on the porch, no fire, no words, just the weight of a summer night laid gentle across their shoulders. Calder handed her a small tin box. Inside was a stone, smooth and pale, with that same symbol he'd carved into bark weeks ago, a wind-shaped curve. The Apache word for survivor. She held it in her hand and asked softly, "What if surviving isn't enough?" Calder's eyes were steady. "Then build something from it." That night she didn't sleep. Not from fear, from certainty. From the quiet ache of knowing that the worst had passed and something better might finally be allowed in. In the days that followed, she carved more simple, useful things, a ladle, a wind chime, a bench beneath the willow. She placed the bench just where the morning light would find it first, and when she sat there with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, she didn't feel like a ghost in her own story anymore. One morning, Finn came back from town with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mabel says we've corrupted you," he joked, "that you're harboring outlaws and planting rebellion in the soil." Eleanor sipped her tea. "She's half right," Finn blinked. "Which half?" She smiled. "The planting part." He laughed until he nearly spilled the basket of eggs he was carrying. Later that week, a young woman from town came by, nervous and flushed, asking for advice on beekeeping. She sat on Eleanor's porch, scribbling notes, her face open and eager. Eleanor answered gently. She gave her the extra hive box she'd kept stored for years, just in case. "For when you're ready," she said. The woman asked, "Do they really listen when you hum?" Eleanor looked out at the garden, at the bees bobbing in the sunlight, and nodded. "Only if you mean it." That night, Calder passed her the last slice of cornbread. She took it without speaking, her hand brushing his. The moment didn't stretch. It simply landed like dust, like peace, like belonging. Some love stories aren't told in grand gestures. They're built from shared silence, from weathered tools, from a woman who no longer has to justify why she's still standing. When the wind moves across Whitlow's place now, it doesn't carry shame or whispers. It carries presence. It carries song. And the sound it makes through the wheat is the sound of a house that once stood alone, now learning how to breathe again. Sometimes the fiercest kind of strength isn't loud or violent. It's a woman standing quietly on her own porch, refusing to be erased. This story isn't just about a widow and two strangers. It's about the power of presence over reputation. about how dignity can outlast gossip and how healing often begins when we let someone stay not because we need saving, but because we finally believe we're worth standing beside. You don't need the world to understand you. You don't need the past to apologize. You only need to stop shrinking for the comfort of others and start reclaiming the space that's always been yours. Some names aren't restored by clearing them. They're restored by living in them fully and without shame. If Eleanor's story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt judged too harshly, stood alone too long, or carried a name heavy with silence, we hope you found a little light here. Stories like this aren't just fiction. They're reminders that healing takes time, that quiet courage matters, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is keep planting even when the world forgets your roots. If this tale moved you, share it with someone who needs reminding that they still matter. And if you believe in stories where redemption doesn't come with fanfare but with presence, consider subscribing. Out here on the frontier, we tell tales for the overlooked, the resilient, the survivors. And you, friend, you're welcome here.